Hello, welcome to today's installment of the 2020 Tribal Alliance for Pollinators webinar series. Today's presentation will be Climate Adaptation Techniques and Strategies for Land Managers. Our distinguished speaker will be Kristen Schmitt. Kristen works for the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub, working with partners on climate change adaptation planning for natural resources, as well as various training and educational events. A large part of Kristen's role with NIACS is thinking about how adaptation resources can help address the needs of different partners and regions across the U.S., such as developing new tools and adaptation menus focused on specific areas, such as California forest or Great Lakes coastal ecosystems. Before we get started with our main part of our program, I have a few quick announcements. First of all, I wanted to announce that at long last, the final edits for the new TAP website are now complete, and the site is live at tribalallianceforpollinators.com. You can use the site to find out about our upcoming webinars and events, as well as to access our educational resources, our seed bank, our tool lending library, and many other things. You can also become an official member of TAP there. Colin Spriggs, our TAP manager, worked really hard getting the website perfect, and I think it looks great, so we're excited to be able to share it with you now. Please mark your calendars for our next webinar, which will be on December 3rd at 2 o'clock with Dr. Chip Taylor, talking about how changes in climate impact monarchs and pollinator populations. It should be a great presentation, and you can access the registration through our TAP website, and we will also be sending out emails about it. During today's presentation, please type in any questions that you have for Kristen onto the little box on the webinar dashboard, and we will cover those at the end. So I think we're ready to go, and I will turn it over to Kristen at this point. There we go.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jane. Please interrupt me if I, for whatever reason, start sounding weird or you can't see what I'm talking about, and I'll do my best to fix it.
Okay, the screen looks great. So thank you very much.
Great. Okay, hi everyone, and thanks so much to Jane and Colin for inviting me to give this webinar today. I'm really excited to be talking to this group. What I'm going to be focusing on today is some of the tools that our group works with to help people develop climate change adaptation strategies for their own land and their own natural resources priorities. As Jane mentioned, my name is Kristen Schmitt, and I'm actually based up in Duluth, Minnesota. We work a lot in areas of the Midwest and Northeast, but we're starting to work more and more across the country and with partners in a variety of different natural resource management areas. So hopefully, you know, even if you're not in the Midwest and Northeast, there's something that's interesting to you in this presentation today. And hopefully I do an adequate job of describing how a lot of these can apply across a broader landscape. I just want to give the briefest introduction to my group that I work for, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. Our focus is really on, you know, how do we provide practical, usable information on climate change and carbon stewardship to people who are working on the ground. And we work with a variety of different organizations to help us do that. The Forest Service is a big partner, but we also work with academic organizations, nonprofit organizations, tribal organizations, to help us figure out the direction of where we want to go with a lot of our work. So what I really want to talk about today, first, just a little bit of an introduction to adaptation and at least how we approach adaptation at NIACS. I'll call Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science NIACS from here on out. It's just a lot easier to say. So that's what I mean when I give you that acronym. I'll talk about some of the adaptation tools that we use for helping folks on the ground think about adaptation on their own land. And then I'll give a few examples of adaptation in action, of examples of folks that have used these tools to think about their own adaptation priorities. So to start off with, what do we mean when we are talking about adaptation? At NIACS, we really take a very broad view of adaptation. We consider this any action that we're doing to help prepare ourselves or prepare ecosystems that we care about for climate change. And I want to really recognize that a lot of those actions are building upon other things that we might already be doing. So things like conservation or sustainable management or restoration, a lot of those types of actions that you're already probably very familiar with make a lot of sense in future climates as well. So they can be considered adaptation actions. But we think the real key to this is making these actions intentional. So, you know, we feel like there's a real need to take a critical look at what you're doing on the ground, on the landscape, put it through that climate change filter, and really intentionally ask yourself, do these things that we're doing still make sense with the climate challenges that we're facing, or potentially climate opportunities, or are there other things that we should be doing a little bit differently? So it's this intentionality piece that we really think is important in climate adaptation planning. And I think central to the way that we approach adaptation with folks that we work with is that there's no one right way to adapt to climate change. The actions that you take on the ground are going to really depend on your values as an organization or as a landowner or land steward, the place where you're working and what you're trying to accomplish there, and also just the tools available at your disposal. And so looking at that there's no one right way to adapt to climate change, there's really a spectrum of adaptation options that are available to us. And this is kind of the broadest category of how we like to characterize adaptation options: resistance, resilience, and transition. I won't go into these terms in a lot of depth. I think some folks may be familiar, some folks less so. But really, I like to just kind of point out that these are a spectrum. When we're thinking about resistance and resilience, we're really talking about adaptation approaches that recognize that we want to keep ecosystems recognizable as the same system. We want them to persist into the future, given climate challenges. So, you know, this might be very appropriate when there is a high value resource or something that is culturally important on that landscape, something that you want to remain there and that you want to persist into the future under these new climates. Transition is a little bit different because there we're really talking about managing for change and really helping an ecosystem align a little bit better with future climates. So none of these are wrong. It just represents different types of actions or decisions that you might make depending on what you're going for with your overall adaptation. And another thing that we really try to emphasize is that when you're designing adaptation actions for a landscape, it's really great to think about actions that are robust across a range of potential future conditions. There's still a lot of uncertainty associated with the degree of climate change that we're expecting in the future. And so actions that are win-win, actions that will be beneficial across a range of potential climate futures are really a lot of where we want to be looking. And fortunately, there's a lot of those in natural resources management. So just a brief introduction to adaptation, but I want to go through some of the tools that we often use with the land management community for thinking about how to apply adaptation on your own land. So I think first of all, you know, I mentioned that there's no one right way to adapt to climate change. So we know that any approach to adaptation is going to need to be flexible. This is probably super dating myself with this image here, but if anybody remembers back to the 80s and 90s, we used to have these choose your own adventure books, right? So they allow you to kind of choose your own direction based on what you're thinking as you read this book. And that's really kind of a little bit of a metaphor for our adaptation resources as well. We have a kind of a collection of resources that we use to help people choose their preferred approach to adaptation. So this is something that's going to help you make decisions about how to adapt to climate change on your land. It's designed to be flexible and to accommodate different types of goals and values, different types of lands, and really allow the user to customize adaptation actions based on their circumstances. It's never going to tell you, you should do X or you should do Y. It's more of a decision-making tool. And I do want to point out, so the title of that suite of resources is Forest Adaptation Resources. Our organization comes from a pretty forest-centric background. We really started working in forested ecosystems, and that's really changed over the past couple of years, especially. We started working more and more with different stakeholders across the U.S. who are interested in different types of ecosystems or different types of perspectives, really, on natural resource management. And so we've tried to broaden our focus to work with folks outside of just that forest realm. So going back to our adaptation tools, I want to talk about two components of this really today, and they work hand in hand, they work together. The Adaptation Workbook and menus of adaptation strategies and approaches. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of those. The workbook is really just a decision-making process. For those folks who are familiar with adaptive management, this cycle, these steps might look very familiar. So this is really just an adaptive management process that explicitly incorporates climate change. So the idea here is that, climate change can be a really big, daunting subject, and there's a lot of information out there. So using a stepwise process like this lets you take all of that information, all that daunting information, and kind of break it down into a series of manageable steps. So rather than trying to think about everything at once, you're focused on one step at a time. And as a part of this process, we do like to pull in other types of resources on, for example, in step 2, pulling in resources on vulnerability and climate change impacts. And that could include a lot of different types of resources. So, scientific vulnerability assessments or traditional ecological knowledge, a variety of different types of information to include there. And then the other thing that we like to pull in, oops, if my slide wants to advance here, are these menus of adaptation strategies and approaches. And we really use these as tools to help identify adaptation tactics. And I'll talk a little bit more about that component of it. So you're probably thinking, okay, what is an adaptation menu? What are we talking about here? I guess the simplest way to explain it, adaptation menus are really just what they sound like. If you go to a restaurant, you sit down with a menu, you're able to pick and choose from that based on what works for you, what sounds good to you. And adaptation menus are kind of the same thing. They are lists of comprehensive adaptation actions. They tend to be specific to a discipline, so something like forestry or forested watersheds or wetlands. And they're also organized into a tiered hierarchy. So kind of like, on a classic menu, you'd see a number of things under the breakfast items, a number of things under beverages. For our menus, we kind of move from these broad categories down to these specific actions in the same way. And they're not meant to be checklists. They're meant to provide a little bit of inspiration for picking and choosing. You're not going to order everything on the menu. You're going to select based on what works for you. And these menus work the same way. We think that menus are helpful for addressing a number of challenges that that our stakeholders encounter when they're thinking about climate adaptation. And I'll talk about each of these in sequence here, each of these challenges. So one challenge that we hear a lot from folks who are on the ground is this difficulty of connecting broad adaptation ideas with specific actions on the landscape. So a lot of people will come to us and say, oh yeah, I read this paper on adaptation. It says we need to promote resilience. How do I do that? Like, I don't know what that means on my piece of property or my piece of land. So it can be hard to step down that really big general idea to, what am I actually going to go out and do next week or next month, next year? So the adaptation menus, we hope, provide a way of doing that. And I'm going to go through an example here from the forestry menu. So say you kind of have this big wish to pursue resistance to climate change on your property. You want to resist change as long as possible. You like that ecosystem. You want to keep it on the landscape. One of the strategies from the forestry menu is to maintain or create refugia, which again is kind of a big general idea. If you step that down to a slightly more specific approach, that could be to prioritize and maintain unique sites on your landscape. And then a specific tactic underneath that might be to manage north-facing slopes on your property as cool condition islands. So on those northern-facing slopes, you might want to retain hemlock and promote hemlock regeneration. So that's kind of stepping down, okay, what does resistance, this big concept of resistance and maintaining refugia actually mean for my specific landscape? I mentioned this before, but again, this is something we think is really important. So making your actions intentional. A menu kind of helps you connect the dots between your overall goal, what do you want to accomplish on that landscape, and what you're actually doing. So rather than, selecting a couple of actions that sound good for climate adaptation, we think it's really important that these tie back to what do you actually want to see on the landscape? What are your overarching goals for that land? And the menus can help you make that connection. My goal is to, do these kind of bigger adaptation options or strategies. So I'm going to select these specific approaches and tactics to accomplish that. We also think that the menus can be a valuable communication tool. So they can, we use these oftentimes in workshops to help people specify some of their adaptation ideas and really tell a story about why they're taking certain actions on the landscape. So again, it's kind of about connecting those dots back up to here's what we're trying to accomplish on the landscape, and here's how we're going about that, and being able to tell that in a succinct, coherent story. This example you see here is from a workshop, obviously pre-COVID times, and it's someone who created a short poster to highlight some of their adaptation ideas. And another way that you can actually look at, I apologize, I didn't include the URL in here, but I have it later on if you want to look at that. We also have an online way that people can communicate their adaptation ideas. So each one of these dots on here is an adaptation demonstration project that really allows the stakeholders who are working with the land managers to give us those highlights about what they want to do on the landscape and what adaptation actions they're selecting. And finally, we hope that adaptation menus are helpful for boosting creativity. A lot of times, we go into conservation planning or land management planning thinking of what we already want to do, and it might just take a little bit of a nudge or seeing a different idea, looking at it from a different perspective to go beyond that and think of a new way of accomplishing a goal. So we hope that the menus are valuable in doing that as well. So finally, really what I've been talking about in these past couple slides is if the adaptation menu and the workbook are working well together, it creates this way of connecting the dots, both for folks who might come after you, who might be managing lands after you're managing them, or connecting the dots for stakeholders, for example, between what you want to accomplish on the landscape, what your potential climate-related challenges and opportunities might be, the intent of your adaptation, and then those specific actions. So if we can do that, then we consider that a success. I want to talk just a little bit about how these menus are developed, so you get an idea of what goes into them. So I guess without going into too much detail, a lot of our menu development is really based on literature review and interviews with researchers and practitioners. So traditionally, this has really come from, a Western science centric perspective. Been very focused on the types of literature that's out there. We also do implement a testing phase. So after that menu is created, after we've compiled all of this scientific literature and these ideas and we've sorted them into a menu, we do want to test those with real world adaptation projects. So make sure they actually make sense to people who are working on the ground and that they can be used in a project situation. So this is generally how we have developed menus in the past. And I do want to just kind of mention one notable exception to that. And I won't talk too much about this because I think there's going to be a separate presentation in this series on the tribal adaptation menu. But this really is a departure from the method that I just described for menu creation. Around 2018, a lot of our stakeholders were kind of telling us, yeah, your adaptation menus are great, they're useful, but a lot of these are really reflective of Western science and, this resource-centric perspective. Similar to the language I've been using throughout this presentation, land management, natural resources management. And several of our stakeholders were really wanting to create a menu that reflected more Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing. And so that menu has been created, it's been published. It was a long process to get there and involved a lot of great partners and stakeholders to help us do that. And I just want to give one example of how some of the strategies and approaches differ between one of our more science-centric menus and then the Western science-centric menus and then tribal adaptation menu. So on the forest adaptation menu side here, strategy 9 is to facilitate community adjustments through species transitions. An approach underneath that is to introduce species that are expected to be adapted to future conditions. A similar strategy on the tribal adaptation menu is to also encourage community adjustments and transition, but while maintaining reciprocity and balance. And one of the approaches that is unique to the tribal adaptation menu that was included there is to seek out and share traditional and cultural knowledge of potential new beings from tribal communities where these beings are native. So again, similar ideas contained, but with a much different perspective and language included in that. And so there's probably a lot more I could say about that, but hopefully I'll have a presentation in the future specifically on the tribal adaptation menu from one of our partners. And I should mention that effort was really, it involved a big group of people, but it was really led by GLFWC, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. So just a little bit more on menu development. I mentioned that we've been kind of moving from forestry into a lot of different sectors and resource areas given partner needs. So this is just a list of the menus that are either published or in progress as of right now. And this might actually not even have all of them on there. I do want to draw your attention, just kind of given the focus of this group, to the wildlife management menu. A lot of where we were coming from in these menus is really vegetation centric, and the wildlife management menu does take a little bit of a different focus on some of the vegetation management issues, really incorporating more about wildlife population management ideas and some of that wildlife centric literature. So that might be an interesting one for folks on this audience. Okay, let's see, I flew through that, hopefully not too fast, but I wanted to take some time to go through some adaptation examples. So these are all folks who have, used the adaptation workbook and the menu in some way to think about adaptation actions for their own land and their own individual circumstances. And I'll go through a couple of examples. These are the general locations, and then I've got one out in California, but it didn't fit on this map. So, so there's one dot missing here. And if you're curious to see more on different adaptation projects and what people have chosen what kind of adaptation directions they've chosen, the URL is listed on the bottom of this page here. So you can find all of this stuff through forestadaptation.org. Our first example is from a location in Pennsylvania, actually, and this was interesting. We don't often work with stakeholders in the National Guard, but we had a training specifically for the National Guard at one point. So everybody brought projects from their lands where they were working. And I thought this one was interesting because it was really focused on a species. A lot of what they're trying to do with their management at Fort Indiantown Gap National Guard Training Center is maintain this regal fritillary butterfly habitat. It's one of the only known populations in the eastern United States, and it's a really important component of their management in that facility. So they kind of had these two overarching goals. One was to provide a safe training environment, and then one was to improve their regal fritillary butterfly habitat. So some of the climate challenges they were most worried about were changing phenology. So really starting to see a mismatch between the life cycle of the butterfly and the life cycle of some of the key nectar species on the landscape for that butterfly. They were also worried about increased potential for wildfire, which could affect some of their training practices, and encroachment of non-native plant species. Here, I just grabbed a few of their selected adaptation actions, so I didn't overwhelm you with a long list, but I think one thing that was interesting about this project is that the group really decided that their goals of expanding butterfly habitat and expanding training area were really compatible. So if they spent some time removing some woody species from their property and restoring warm season grasses, those grasses would be more in line with future fire regimes. It would be better for the butterflies, and it would be easier to train on. So they kind of had this nice confluence of, hey, just restoring these grasses would be really great for all of our goals that we're trying to accomplish. They also really wanted to look at alternative species that could host the butterflies, though. So again, kind of worried about this mismatch and timing issue. They started a program to evaluate, okay, what other types of species outside of this one key violet will the butterfly use for different aspects of its life cycle. And you can find a little bit more about this adaptation demonstration at the URL on the bottom. So another example I wanted to bring to the fore, this one's a little bit different, takes place in Southern California on the San Bernardino National Forest. And this was kind of an interesting project because the goals really focused on recreation. So in this particular scenario, the forest was having a lot of issues with increased visitation to this Lytle Creek area. That's a picture of Lytle Creek that you see on the right there. And they were seeing a lot of visitor impacts. So the goals of their project were really to provide safe recreational facilities while kind of directing visitors away from these sensitive areas of the creek. And also they wanted to maintain the riparian health and stream connectivity here. Some of the climate challenges they were most worried about are more hot days, and extreme hot days just meant more and more people are actually coming to this forest, and particularly wanting to come to the creek. There's a lot of potential in this region for increased drought or increased droughty periods, and so that might provide a lot of challenges for stream flow and a lot of potential stream flow changes. And then finally, just from a safety perspective, they were worried about extreme precipitation and wildfire in this area. And, you know, what are they going to do if one of these events happens when a lot of people are down there visiting this site? In this case, the managers in the situation used an adaptation menu that focused on recreation. So some of these actions might look a little bit different from others that I've been talking about. And again, this is just a few of the actions they decided from a longer list, but they really wanted to design their infrastructure in a way that wouldn't bother people in the heat. So they thought about, you know, using lighter colors to build some of their facilities. They wanted to add shade structures at picnic areas to help disperse a lot of the picnicking that was going on outside of the riparian corridor. So a lot of their actions just focused on how do we provide comfortable places for people that aren't right in the stream. They also wanted to bump up their interpretation, their enforcement staff for the heavy recreation season to kind of, you know, help people comply with different regulations and, you know, help pick up trash. And they decided to work with a local telecommunications company to get cell phone service into the canyon for potential emergencies that are expected to increase with climate. So again, just a few examples of adaptation action. Okay, maybe I'll do one more here. So this is from kind of near where I live, actually. This is from a state natural area in Wisconsin. And in this case, the group really wanted to think about restoring and reestablishing wild rice on this lake and just maintaining it as kind of a wildlife resource. So maintaining this as a shallow, muck-bottomed lake. As many of you might know on this call, you know, wild rice is one of those species that is particularly vulnerable to climate changes. So a lot of the challenges they're looking at are increased water levels in this lake, current invasives, potential invasive species coming in, and altered water quality as a result of some of these extreme precipitation events that are becoming more and more frequent. And in this case, they actually used a couple of different menus to select adaptation actions. So they used both the tribal adaptation menu that I mentioned earlier and the wetlands menu, and selected different actions from each. So some of the things they really wanted to do were related to just understanding more about Spur Lake, this lake and its history, understanding more about, you know, the history of wild rice in this area and seeing if they could glean some knowledge about how to reestablish it based on that. So for a lot of these activities, they partnered with GLFWC, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, to better understand, you know, what some of the knowledge out there is on historic rice camps past harvest and the history of the lake. And then a couple of their specific management actions that they chose were to monitor and control perennial species that often compete with wild rice. They wanted to kind of do a little bit of an experiment on, can we increase ice thickness on the lake to really suppress those perennial species? So there's a relationship there between, ice thickness and these perennials, but they wanted to see if they could manipulate that at all, clear the snow off the ice, increase that ice depth, and really reduce the competition to wild rice there. And then they started a collaborative project on a wild rice seed bank study as well. So I don't want to bore folks too much with examples. This next one here, I'll just mention briefly, and I don't know, maybe we even have Yvette on the call with us today, but I wanted to throw this in there just because it was mentioned in the announcement for this, this webinar here. So this example actually came out of a workshop we had specifically for the tribal adaptation menu. So that's the menu we were using in this workshop. And this is a small wetland restoration project that took place in Oklahoma. The goals of this project were to restore the wetland area, provide habitat and a water source for wildlife, and also provide access for kids and for tribal citizens to just enjoy this wetland. Again, some of the climate challenges that managers were dealing with in this area are changes to seasonal precipitation, potential long periods of dry conditions, and extreme heat or rainfall. And so some of the actions that were selected off the tribal adaptation menu really had to do with engagement and how to engage the community in thinking about this wetland restoration. So requesting elder input on the management plan, and including strategies for how to involve the youth program and the daycare in using this new area, and also consulting elders on appropriate language for interpretive materials. So hopefully that wasn't too many examples for you, but I wanted to give you a little smattering of from around the country of often, the shape that adaptation can take. And I just want to emphasize this point again, that in a lot of cases, you might be looking at these examples and thinking, well, that's not really that different from current management. It's not that different from what I'm doing already. And that's true. I think, as we work with more and more groups, we kind of see adaptation shake out a little bit like this pie chart here. This is a very unofficial pie chart, but unscientific pie chart. But there's a lot of things that people choose as adaptation actions that, aren't necessarily brand new things, but climate change just makes them more important. They still make sense under climate change. There's a big chunk of the pie that might be small tweaks or small changes to improve the effectiveness of adaptation. So sometimes that's changing up a species mix, or maybe the timing of when you're planting, or site preparation to help smaller seedlings survive. All of those might fall into the small tweaks category. But then often we do get some new and different actions, some things that might seem a little wild or crazy or outside the norm, but that, again, really makes sense when we're looking at some of the future climate scenarios. So finally, I just want to say that you can find out more about all of these adaptation menus and various examples of projects that have used those if you go to this URL here at the bottom. So again, all of this is kind of contained under forestadaptation.org. And if you click on the Adapt tab, you can find these strategies and approaches menus and see the different focus areas of those. So I will stop there and leave some time for questions or comments, or if Yvette's on the phone and wants to offer any clarifications on our project, that's great too. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Okay. So first of all, thank you. That was a terrific presentation, and just anyway, so thank you for that. So the first question we have is, how do you see the management of invasive species changing as climate becomes more of an issue?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. And I feel like I have constant consternation about this one, and I've talked to a lot of people about it to get their input. I think that one of the things that's becoming more apparent in a lot of situations is that we might just have to target invasive species management a little bit better. And again, all of this depends on your goals and objectives, right? So I was talking to one manager who really thought that, for example, buckthorn, which we have a real issue with here in the Midwest, maybe it's just time to accept that buckthorn is going to occur in some of our more urban forest environments, and not necessarily focus our attention on getting rid of it, but really focus our attention on getting rid of buckthorn in some of these more sensitive ecosystems, like, for example, fen ecosystems in southern Michigan. So that's a very specific example, but I think, it really gets back to this idea of where to prioritize these actions. Are there places where we just kind of, as much as it goes against what we've been taught often as natural resource managers, are there places where we just kind of have to let it go and accept that that's now a part of the ecosystem and figure out ways that we can live with it? Whereas, there might be other areas where we really feel like we need to target those invasives in order to maintain certain values and certain qualities of that landscape. So I think that's one thing. And I've also been talking with a lot of folks who are on the coast about this, which is kind of interesting. And some of what I've heard from them is that, some of these invasives actually are pretty useful for reducing erosion and, holding the sand in place. And even though they're technically non-native, they're not so bad from an ecosystem perspective, whereas others are, really damaging and will kind of take over an ecosystem. So, in that case, maybe it's a matter of kind of picking and choosing which species tend to have the more detrimental impact in a particular situation and really targeting those as opposed to all non-natives.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so next question: How would if somebody was interested in becoming a demo site, how would they do that with you all?
Ooh, great question. I'd say a great way to start might be just send me an email at that email down there, and you can kind of explain your situation a little bit more. In order to do a demo, we really like to go through the adaptation workbook with people, and there's a couple ways to do that. We have regular online classes, online courses where you can kind of bring your own project and then walk through the workbook with a group of managers from all over. We have a new one of those that's starting this winter in January. Or if you just kind of want to think about adaptation on your land, best way is just to send out an initial inquiry, and we can go from there and figure out the best way to do it.
Okay, good. Okay, next, what sort of challenges face grassland ecosystems?
Ooh, that is a really good question, and that is admittedly a little bit outside of my realm of expertise. There is a grasslands menu that a few folks are working on, but that's my coworkers. I'm not directly involved in that because I don't have a great history with grasslands. It's a good question. I think, with some folks I've worked with, they feel that climate changes will be generally supportive of grasslands in some areas of the country. So for example, I'm working with some folks in southern Michigan who are trying to do some prairie restoration. They're like, oh, actually a lot of these prairie plants are kind of well supported by these future climates that we're expecting. So in that case, maybe it kind of increases the incentive for restoration a little bit. Challenges I have heard of do involve, invasives, maybe non-native grasses getting in and really messing up fire regimes, for example, or, changing fire regimes really affecting the species composition in those grasslands. So those are some of the ones that I've heard brought up. But again, I'm not the best person to ask on this, so I apologize for that.
No, that's okay. And then just one last thing, is there any charge to work with NIACS?
Generally, no. It depends on every individual situation. We are directly funded to do certain projects, being a nonprofit, I suppose. But really, our goal is to help anyone who wants to be helped with climate adaptation. So, we will do our best to find a way to work with you if you're interested in this type of thing.
Okay, good. Okay, and then we had one more question just come in here. With water resources being shared more and more with tribal and governmental agencies, will you help multiple groups at one time? I guess if they're working on a shared water resource.
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, we do that, and we're trying to figure out the best way to kind of use this menu process to bring different groups together. Don't know, I didn't really emphasize it, but the first step of the adaptation process always really starts with, what are your goals on the landscape? What are you trying to accomplish? Mm-hmm. And obviously, when you've got multiple organizations working together, that might look very different depending on the organizations that are in the room. And so, using this to kind of come to a common understanding about what some of those goals are is a potential outcome. It's not always necessarily the easiest thing to orchestrate. I will say, and even though this isn't a presentation on the tribal adaptation menu, we hope to be using that menu more and more to work across organizational lines and kind of work, for example, in our area with the Forest Service and with some of the tribes who are their neighbors, to kind of bring more of a cultural perspective into their management. So it's almost as like, a learning tool for the Forest Service in a lot of ways, to kind of understand more of that indigenous way of thinking about some of these adaptation concepts. So we have been thinking about different ways to bring that menu in explicitly to kind of talk across agency and group lines. But I think it's a really great question. We have done it in a few cases, and whoever asked that question, I'd be happy to send you a few examples from the demo list if you're interested to see that. It's just, it's a challenge depending on how different the group's goals and objectives for the landscape are.
Yeah, and that's a complex, concept in and of itself, isn't it? Okay, here we go. Here's Yvette. All right, so this is Yvette. I highly recommend the workshop for the TAM Tribal Adaptation Menu. Also, as we worked on the rebuilding of the wetland education site, it was Yuchi Butterfly Farm who donated nearly 1,000 Oklahoma native plants to establish habitat for pollinators. And our goals are being achieved even in the COVID environment. The wildlife are using the site, and the children are, and the Iowa tribal staff are using it. So anyway, that's
thanks,
very,
Yvette.
very good to hear. Thank you. Thank you, Yvette. Thank you for sharing that. And I know Colin and Brandon, I think, both were out there with Yvette in that site. And there was Colin chiming right in. Great to hear. I know they felt very. And there's Mado, Kristen, and Jane. Thank you, Mado, to you, to Yvette, and just I guess this is kind of this is the best case scenario for TAP. This is what we'd like to do, is if we can bring together just different organizations and tribes and agencies and all that to try and pool resources to get this work done. I mean, that's just to us the best possible thing when we can see that happen. So we love that we were able to be, in some small way, a help to Yvette and Iowa Nation on that project too. So thank you. Okay, do we have, oh, okay, here we go. One more. I'm sorry if I missed it. Is there a link for the booklet for the menu?
Ooh, excellent question. Maybe I can, let's see, will it work if I try and chat that in to the chat box?
Yeah, let's see if it does.
Okay,
And
let's see if that works. You can, let me go ahead and stop share here. So I can just grab that URL and make sure that I don't mess it up. Okay. Sorry, I should have been more on top of and ready with that, but
no, it's okay. You're doing a fantastic job.
here we go. All right, I'll get that in there.
Okay, and yeah, if not, feel free to text me or Colin or any of us later, and we'll happy to share that, or Kristen directly. So.
Okay, I think it went to just the organizers and panelists. So I don't know if you can chat that to everyone, Jane, or maybe we can just send it out with, okay.
Okay. I don't even, okay. Let's see. Organizers and panelists. Let me see if I can. Wait, now I'm okay.
But just one easy URL to remember, or hopefully easy one, is that forestadaptation.org, all one word.
Okay.
And so if you go there, there will be a tab called Adaptation Strategies, and that will have links to all of the menus.
Okay, hang on real quick. I think I can. It's gonna let me do this. Okay, I'm just gonna have to send this out later because I don't think.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. I should have. Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. Yes, I will send this out. Kim, I will send this out to you later personally, and I can send it out to the whole list as well. So sorry. Anyway, I'll learn how to do this later, but on the fly, this is a little challenging. This is okay. All righty. So, do we have any more questions from anybody? And if not, again, thank you, Kristen. This was just really, really interesting. It was interesting both in terms of, what TAP is trying to do, but just as somebody trying to restore land, tribal land, it was, you made it so easy and so accessible. Sometimes when I think about adaptation and look at all the different things we have to do, it feels a little overwhelming. And I loved how you were able to break that down into steps, because and make it, that we can all do this. And thank you for making it accessible for all of us. So thank you.
Thanks, Jane.
Okay,
yes,
with that,
I think,
well, we can all do this, and you're going to help point us in the right direction. And TAP is here to help too. So anyway, thank you all. And again, our new website, tribalallianceforpollinators.com. Please go check it out. It looks fantastic. There's all sorts of great, if you go to the resources portion of it, we've got we got training videos, we've got PowerPoints, we've got all sorts of stuff in there. And most excitingly, we've got our seed bank online now. So you can see what we've got available, what the plants are useful for. We've got our lending library of equipment. We got all that kind of stuff. So anyway, and then also our links to the upcoming events. So you can see what webinars we have. We're also in the planning stages right now for a pretty big conference in October 2021 if the vaccine information continues to proceed the way it looks like it's going to, and so we'll be sending out an announcement about that pretty soon too. But we have travel scholarship money, and we hope that we can get people truthfully from all over the country to come attend again. So anyway, thank you. Happy Friday, and please don't hesitate to reach out if we can help you with anything. Okay, thank you. Bye.